A golden retriever suddenly ran out of a nearly bankrupt coffee shop and led his owner into the pouring rain. Minutes later, they discovered a homeless old man hiding beneath a cold awning. The owner gave him the last bowl of soup in his kitchen and thought that was the end of it. He was wrong. Because just days later, the old man would stare at a photograph and whisper, "No, that's impossible." Hidden inside that picture was a secret powerful enough to destroy a billionaire, trigger a federal investigation, and expose a betrayal buried for 30 years. A cold rain drifted through downtown Portland, Oregon, turning the sidewalks into sheets of silver beneath the streetlights. Most people hurried home. A few simply hoped to find somewhere warm enough to make it through the night. For more than 10 years, Ethan Parker had opened the doors of Parker's Coffee House before sunrise and locked them long after dark. Now, at 42 years old, he stood alone behind the counter, wondering if he was only days away from losing everything he had built. Ethan was a tall white man with a lean frame that had grown thinner over the past year. His sandy brown hair was beginning to gray around the temples, and a short beard framed a face marked more by worry than age. People in the neighborhood knew him as a quiet, dependable man. He rarely complained and always remembered his customers' names. Years earlier, after losing his father to a sudden heart attack, Ethan had poured his inheritance into opening the coffee shop. Since then, the business had become more than a job. It had become the last piece of family he had left. The cafe was nearly empty that evening. 3 customers sat near the front window nursing cups of coffee, while rain tapped steadily against the glass. Ethan opened a drawer beneath the register. Another overdue bill. Another warning notice. Another reminder that the bank would soon take possession of the building if he couldn't make the payments. He slowly folded the paper and slipped it back into the drawer. "What's the point of looking at it again?" he muttered. A soft whine interrupted his thoughts. Cooper stood beside him. The golden retriever was 6 years old, with thick golden fur, warm brown eyes, and a gentle temperament that seemed to attract strangers everywhere he went. Ethan had adopted him from a rescue shelter after the dog had been abandoned by a previous owner. Since then, Cooper had become a constant companion, spending nearly every day curled beside the counter greeting customers. Ethan scratched behind the dog's ears. "At least you're not worried about mortgages." Cooper wagged his tail. For a moment, Ethan managed to smile. Then the bell above the door rattled as another gust of wind pushed against the entrance. One of the customers near the window shook his head. "Looks like another dead night." Ethan forced a polite smile. Inside, however, he felt something much darker. Every empty table felt like evidence of failure. Every unpaid bill felt like a personal accusation. Maybe the bank was right. Maybe the neighborhood no longer needed his cafe. Maybe all those years of sacrifice had been for nothing. The thought settled heavily in his chest. A few minutes later, Ethan began preparing to close. He stacked chairs, turned off half the lights, wiped down the counter one last time. Then suddenly Cooper sprang to his feet. The dog's ears perked up. His entire body became alert. Before Ethan could react, Cooper rushed toward the door. "Hey!" The dog pushed through as a customer exited and disappeared into the rain. Ethan groaned. "Cooper!" Pulling on his jacket, he hurried outside. Cold rain soaked his shoulders instantly. The street was nearly empty. He spotted Cooper halfway down the block. The dog wasn't running. He was sitting, waiting. Ethan followed him toward an old brick building with a narrow overhang. Then he saw the man. An elderly black man sat curled beneath the shelter, trying unsuccessfully to protect himself from the rain. His clothes were worn and several sizes too large. His gray beard had grown unevenly across a weathered face. Deep lines surrounded his eyes. Despite his age, there was something dignified about the way he sat, as if life had taken everything from him except his pride. Cooper walked directly to him. The old man slowly lifted a trembling hand. To Ethan's surprise, the dog leaned forward immediately. No hesitation, no fear, just trust. The old man's eyes softened. "Well," he whispered, "aren't you a friendly fellow?" Ethan stopped beside them. "You know him?" The man shook his head. "No." His voice was rough and tired. "Guess your dog just has better instincts than most people." Something about that answer stayed with Ethan. Most people. Not all people. Most people. The difference seemed important. The old man's hands trembled violently from the cold. Ethan looked down at the thin jacket barely covering him. Then he looked back toward the warm lights of the cafe. He already knew what he was going to do, even before his practical side started arguing against it. "Come on," Ethan said. The man looked surprised. "What?" "Come inside." The old man hesitated. "I don't have money. I'm not asking for money." For several seconds, neither man moved. Finally, the stranger nodded. Inside the cafe, the remaining customers watched curiously as Ethan guided the old man to a booth. The warmth seemed to hit him immediately. His shoulders relaxed. His hands stopped shaking quite as much. Ethan headed toward the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator. There wasn't much left. A small container of soup. The final loaf of bread, enough for one last meal. He stared at it for several moments. Tomorrow he would need to buy supplies. Tomorrow he would need money he didn't have. But when he thought about the old man sitting alone in the rain, the decision became easy. A few minutes later, Ethan placed a steaming bowl of soup in front of him. The smell filled the booth. The old man's eyes widened slightly. "Thank you." The words were quiet but sincere. He began eating slowly at first, then faster, like someone trying to maintain dignity while fighting hunger. From across the room, one customer laughed softly. "There goes another free meal." His friend smirked. "No wonder the place is going under." Ethan heard every word. So did the old man. For a brief moment, embarrassment flashed across the stranger's face. But Ethan simply returned to wiping tables. He refused to look toward the comments, refused to acknowledge them, because deep down he knew something. If helping someone hungry was the reason he failed, then perhaps failure wasn't the thing he should be ashamed of. Over the next several days, the routine continued. Every evening Walter Johnson appeared. That was the old man's name. He never shared much about himself. Never explained where he came from, never talked about family. Yet Cooper greeted him each time as though welcoming an old friend. The bond between them seemed almost impossible to explain. Meanwhile, Ethan's situation worsened. Another notice arrived from the bank, then another. Finally, the official foreclosure warning came. 3 days, that was all he had left. 3 days before the cafe would belong to someone else. The realization haunted him. Late one evening, Ethan sat alone staring at the notice. Walter occupied his usual booth. Cooper suddenly jumped to his feet. The dog trotted toward the door. A minute later, he returned carrying something in his mouth, a worn leather wallet. Rainwater dripped from its cracked surface. Ethan frowned. "Where did you find that?" Cooper dropped it onto the table. Curious, Ethan opened it. Inside was almost nothing. No cash, no identification. Just an old photograph faded by time. Ethan pulled it out carefully. The image showed several men standing in front of what appeared to be an industrial building decades earlier. He glanced toward Walter. The old man's reaction froze him in place. Color drained from Walter's face. His eyes widened. His hands began shaking uncontrollably. For the first time since Ethan had met him, genuine fear appeared in his expression. Walter stood so suddenly that the chair nearly toppled backward. The photograph slipped from Ethan's fingers. Walter stared at it, then whispered in a voice barely audible. "No." His breathing quickened. His eyes never left the image. "No, that can't be possible." Walter Johnson barely slept that night. After his reaction to the photograph, Ethan had offered him a blanket and a place to rest on an old couch in the cafe's storage room. Walter accepted reluctantly, but long after the lights were turned off, he remained awake staring at the ceiling. Memories he had spent decades trying to bury seemed determined to return. The following morning, gray clouds still hung over Portland. Ethan arrived early and found Walter already sitting alone near the front window. A cup of coffee rested untouched in front of him. "You want to tell me what happened last night?" Ethan asked gently. Walter's eyes remained fixed on the street. "No." The answer came quickly, too quickly. Ethan recognized the tone. It was the voice of someone protecting a wound that had never healed. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the photograph once more. There were 6 men standing in front of a massive steel mill. Most were wearing hard hats and work clothes. The image was faded, but several faces remained visible. One face belonged to Walter, much younger, stronger, standing proudly near the center. Another face caught Ethan's attention. He knew it immediately. Everyone in Oregon knew it. Michael Reed, the billionaire developer whose name appeared on skyscrapers, luxury hotels, and charitable foundations throughout the Pacific Northwest. Ethan frowned. "What were you doing with Michael Reed 30 years ago?" Walter looked away. His jaw tightened. "I said leave it alone." The sharpness surprised Ethan. Walter had always been quiet and respectful. Now there was fear in his voice. Real fear. Ethan decided not to push further, at least not yet. As the morning passed, Cooper remained strangely interested in the old wallet. The golden retriever kept returning to it, sniffing intensely before nudging it with his nose. At first Ethan ignored the behavior. Then Cooper began pawing at the inside lining repeatedly. "What's gotten into you?" Ethan asked. The dog whined. Ethan picked up the wallet again. This time he examined it more carefully. The leather was cracked with age, but something felt unusual. One corner seemed thicker than the rest. Using a butter knife from the kitchen, he carefully loosened part of the inner lining. Something metallic slid free. A small brass key. Walter immediately froze. His eyes widened. For several seconds, neither man spoke. "You know what this is," Ethan said quietly. Walter stared at the key, then slowly nodded. "A safety deposit box." Ethan leaned forward. "What's inside?" Walter swallowed. His hands trembled slightly. "I honestly don't know anymore." The answer sounded truthful, and somehow that made everything more unsettling. 2 hours later, they stood inside a downtown Portland bank. The building was older than most surrounding offices, constructed from polished granite and dark wood that gave the interior a sense of permanence. A bank manager named Linda Foster greeted them. Linda was a woman in her late 50s with silver blonde hair cut neatly above her shoulders. Years of working in banking had given her a calm professionalism, but there was kindness behind her blue eyes. After verifying the box number connected to the key, she disappeared into a secure vault. Several minutes later, she returned carrying a small metal container. Walter's breathing grew heavier. The box was placed on a private table. Slowly, he inserted the key. The lock clicked. Inside lay a collection of old documents bound together with fading rubber bands. There were stock certificates, corporate contracts, property records, letters, dozens of them. Ethan carefully picked up one folder. His eyes widened. The documents belonged to Columbia Steel Industries. 30 years earlier, it had been one of Oregon's largest steel manufacturers. At its peak, the company had been worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Walter stared silently at the paperwork. His expression had become distant, as though he were looking at ghosts. "I thought they were gone," he whispered. "What are these?" Ethan asked. Walter rubbed a hand across his face. "My life." The words carried decades of regret. Back at the cafe, Ethan spent hours reviewing the material. The more he read, the more confused he became. Walter's name appeared repeatedly: founder, major shareholder, executive partner. The documents suggested Walter had once held enormous influence within the company. Yet somehow he had ended up homeless. None of it made sense. Meanwhile, 40 miles away, Michael Reed sat in the top floor office of Reed Development Corporation. At 70 years old, Michael remained an imposing figure. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with neatly combed silver hair and sharp gray eyes that seemed constantly calculating. Years of power had taught him how to dominate a room without raising his voice. The office overlooked much of downtown Portland. Normally the view pleased him. Today it didn't. Across his desk sat a young assistant named Trevor Mills, 28 years old, clean-cut, ambitious, and eager to impress. Trevor held a tablet in his hands. "We confirmed the report," Trevor said carefully. Michael remained silent. Trevor continued. "The homeless man near Parker's coffee house is Walter Johnson." For the first time, Michael's expression changed. The color drained slightly from his face. "You're certain?" "Yes, sir." The room became very quiet. Michael stood and walked toward the window. For nearly a minute, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice had become cold. "That's impossible." "Apparently not." Michael's reflection stared back at him from the glass. 30 years. 30 years he had believed the past was buried. 30 years he had built an empire. And now one name threatened everything: Walter Johnson. The name alone brought back memories Michael never wanted revisited. "What else do we know?" he asked. Trevor hesitated. "Not much, but Parker's coffee house appears to be involved." Michael slowly turned. The warmth normally displayed during public appearances was completely gone. In its place stood a man willing to protect everything he had built, no matter the cost. "Keep watching them," he said quietly. Trevor nodded. "And if they find anything?" Michael's eyes hardened. For several long seconds he didn't answer. Then he spoke. "We make sure the past stays where it belongs." Back at the cafe, evening shadows stretched across the floor. Walter sat alone in his booth. The stack of documents rested in front of him. Ethan watched him carefully. For the first time, he realized this story was far bigger than a struggling coffee shop or a homeless man. Somewhere inside those papers was a secret powerful enough to frighten a billionaire. And judging by the look on Walter's face, the worst part of that secret had not yet been revealed. The next morning, the cafe opened later than usual. Ethan barely noticed the customers who came and went. His attention remained fixed on Walter, who sat quietly in the corner booth with the documents spread before him. Sunlight filtered through the front windows, illuminating papers that had spent decades hidden inside a bank vault. For a long time, neither man spoke. Finally, Walter folded one of the stock certificates and stared at it. "You asked me who I was," he said quietly. Ethan looked up. Walter released a slow breath. "I suppose you deserve an answer." The old man's voice carried a weight Ethan had never heard before. Not fear, not sadness, something heavier: regret. Walter leaned back and closed his eyes. 30 years seemed to disappear from his face. When I was younger, I wasn't homeless. I wasn't forgotten. I was one of the founders of Columbia Steel. Ethan remained silent. Walter continued. Back then, he had been known throughout Oregon's manufacturing industry. He was ambitious, intelligent, and respected by employees. He worked long hours and believed deeply in loyalty. He had built the company alongside a small group of partners, including Michael Reed. Michael wasn't rich back then, Walter said. He was smart, charismatic. People trusted him. Walter trusted him too, perhaps more than anyone. For years, the company grew. Factories expanded, contracts multiplied, employees bought homes, families prospered. Walter remembered feeling proud whenever he walked through the steel mill and saw hundreds of workers earning honest paychecks. Then, everything changed. One autumn night, a fire erupted inside the company's largest manufacturing facility. The blaze destroyed equipment worth millions. Several workers were injured. The story dominated local news for weeks. Investigators eventually concluded that negligence caused the disaster, and somehow all responsibility landed on Walter. His signature appeared on maintenance approvals. His name appeared on safety reports. Evidence seemed overwhelming. I knew it wasn't true, Walter said, but nobody listened. The board removed him. Investors abandoned him. Newspapers portrayed him as reckless and incompetent. Within months, he lost his position. Then his ownership shares disappeared through legal settlements he barely understood. The company remained alive, but Walter's life collapsed. His wife could not handle the public humiliation. Friends stopped calling. Former colleagues crossed the street to avoid him. One loss followed another until eventually there was almost nothing left. Ethan listened carefully. He could hear the pain hidden beneath every sentence. Not dramatic pain. The quiet kind. The kind that grows slowly over decades. What about Michael? Ethan asked. Walter stared toward the window. He became a hero. The words sounded bitter. After Walter's departure, Michael Reed assumed greater control over the company. Over time, he transformed his influence into an enormous business empire, while Walter struggled to survive. Michael became a billionaire. A heavy silence settled between them. Then Ethan picked up another document from the table. It contained ownership records, rows of percentages, names, signatures. His eyes narrowed. Walter, the old man looked up. Ethan tapped the paper. You owned most of the company. Walter nodded slowly. 52%. Ethan stared at him. That percentage changed everything. Whoever controlled 52% controlled Columbia Steel, which meant Walter had been the true majority owner, not Michael, not anyone else. Walter's hands trembled slightly. For 30 years, I thought these records were gone. Hope appeared briefly in his eyes, then quickly faded, because both men understood something. Documents alone would not defeat someone as powerful as Michael Reed. Not yet. Still, it was enough to prove one thing. Walter had been robbed. Later that afternoon, Ethan locked the documents inside a metal filing cabinet located in the cafe's tiny office. He checked the lock twice, then a third time. The foreclosure deadline remained only days away, but somehow the cafe no longer felt like his biggest problem. As evening arrived, customers gradually disappeared. Rain began falling again. Cooper slept near the counter. Walter remained unusually quiet. Several times Ethan noticed him staring toward the street, as though expecting someone. Around 9 o'clock, they finally closed for the night. Ethan turned off the lights, locked the front door, and headed upstairs to the small apartment above the cafe. Sleep came slowly. His thoughts kept returning to the documents. The company, Michael Reed, the fire. Something about the entire story felt wrong. Sometime after midnight, a sound pulled him from sleep. A crash. Then another. Ethan sat upright. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. Then Cooper started barking, loudly, aggressively. The dog rarely barked at all. Ethan rushed downstairs, his heart pounded. The moment he reached the cafe floor, he knew something was wrong. The front door stood partially open. Cold air poured inside. A chair had been overturned. One of the windows near the alley had shattered. Glass covered the floor. "Walter!" Ethan shouted. No answer. Panic surged through him. Then he spotted Walter emerging from the storage room. The old man looked shaken but unharmed. "What happened?" Ethan asked. Walter's face had turned pale. "They were here." Ethan hurried toward the office. The filing cabinet door hung open. The lock had been broken clean off. His stomach dropped. No, he already knew. The folders were gone. Every document, every certificate, every contract, every piece of evidence recovered from the safety deposit box. Gone. For several seconds, neither man moved. The reality settled over them like a funeral blanket. Walter slowly lowered himself into a chair. His shoulders sagged. Ethan had never seen him look older, not even on the night they first met. 30 years of struggle seemed to return all at once. "They found us," Walter whispered. His voice cracked. The words hurt more than Ethan expected, because Walter wasn't talking about the burglary. He was talking about hope. For a brief moment, he had allowed himself to believe the truth might finally come out, that maybe his name could be cleared, that maybe his life had not been erased forever. Now that hope appeared gone. Walter stared at the broken office door, his eyes empty. They took everything. Outside, rain continued tapping against the windows. Inside, Cooper slowly walked to Walter's side and rested his head on the old man's knee. Walter placed a trembling hand on the dog's neck. But for the first time since Ethan had met him, he looked like a man who had finally stopped fighting. And deep down, Ethan feared that whoever had stolen those documents had just buried the truth for another 30 years. The morning after the break-in felt different, not because the cafe was any less empty, not because the foreclosure deadline had disappeared, but because something inside Ethan Parker refused to accept defeat. Walter, however, looked like a man carrying the weight of a second funeral. For 2 days he barely spoke. He sat near the front window watching rain drift across Portland's streets, while Cooper remained beside him almost constantly. The golden retriever seemed to sense Walter's despair. Whenever the old man lowered his head, Cooper would quietly rest against his leg as if reminding him he was not alone. On the third morning, Ethan finally made a decision. "We need help," he said. Walter looked up. "No lawyer can fix this." "Maybe not," Ethan replied, "but sitting here won't fix it either." That afternoon they drove across town to meet Rachel Morgan. Rachel was 46 years old, a tall woman with fair skin, sharp blue eyes, and shoulder-length dark blonde hair usually tied neatly behind her head. She carried herself with confidence, but unlike many successful attorneys, she lacked arrogance. 20 years earlier, her father had lost his small construction company after being cheated by a larger corporation. The experience had shaped her career. Since then, she had devoted herself to helping people who lacked the resources to fight powerful opponents. Rachel listened carefully as Walter explained everything: the company, the fire, the stolen documents, the missing decades. She interrupted only occasionally to ask precise questions. When Walter finished, Rachel leaned back in her chair. Then she surprised both men. "You said the documents were stored in a safety deposit box for 30 years? Walter nodded. "Yes. And nobody opened that box before last week?" "Not that I'm aware of." Rachel folded her hands. "Then the thieves probably didn't steal the originals." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Rachel stood and walked toward a whiteboard. "Think about it. If someone feared those documents, they would have wanted them destroyed decades ago. Yet the box remained untouched for 30 years. Walter stared at her. For the first time in days, curiosity replaced hopelessness. Rachel continued, "Which means whoever opened that box before likely anticipated needing copies." The room grew quiet. Then something changed in Walter's expression. A memory. A distant memory. He slowly sat forward. There was another set. Ethan blinked. "What?" Walter rubbed his forehead. "I haven't thought about it in years." The old man closed his eyes. "I made a backup." Rachel immediately grabbed a notepad. "Where?" Walter shook his head. "I don't remember." Frustration crossed his face. "I was planning for emergencies back then. The company was expanding quickly. I trusted Michael, but I didn't trust everyone around him." His breathing slowed. Then another memory surfaced. A warehouse. Rachel looked up. What warehouse? The old maintenance warehouse near the original steel mill. The location had been abandoned for decades. The factory itself no longer existed. Most of the property had been redeveloped. But the warehouse remained standing near the edge of an unused industrial lot. The following morning, the three of them drove there together. The building looked forgotten by time. Broken windows, rusting metal walls, weeds growing through cracked concrete. Walter stood silently for several moments. His eyes moved slowly across the property. The place seemed to awaken memories buried for decades. "I used to come here late at night," he said quietly. "To think." Cooper suddenly became excited. The dog jumped from the truck and began sniffing around the property. His nose moved rapidly across the ground. Then he stopped. His tail stiffened. He started digging. Ethan laughed nervously. "What is it, boy?" Cooper kept digging. Dirt flew in every direction. Within minutes, his paws struck something solid. Metal. All three rushed forward. Partially buried beneath years of soil lay a small steel container. Walter stared at it. His face turned pale. "I remember this." Ethan carefully pulled the box free. The lock had rusted badly. After several attempts, they managed to pry it open. Inside rested several waterproof folders. Rachel immediately began examining the contents. Her eyes widened, then widened again. "Walter." The old man swallowed hard. "What?" Rachel lifted a document. This is it. There were original ownership agreements, financial records, internal company correspondence, signed board resolutions, and most importantly, evidence showing Walter controlled the majority ownership stake before the fire. But there was something even more damaging. A collection of letters, private letters, written by Michael Reed. Rachel quickly scanned several pages. The color drained from her face. "What is it?" Ethan asked. Rachel looked up slowly. "These letters suggest Michael knew the fire wasn't an accident." Silence. Walter stared at her. For a moment he seemed unable to breathe. 30 years of unanswered questions suddenly felt very close to being resolved. But while hope was growing inside the warehouse, trouble was growing elsewhere. High above downtown Portland, Michael Reed stood before a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. Construction plans covered the conference table behind him. His newest project would become the largest development of his career. Luxury residences, retail centers, office towers, billions of dollars. Everything was scheduled to be announced within days. Trevor Mills entered carrying a tablet. His normally calm expression looked troubled. "We have a problem." Michael slowly turned. "What now?" Trevor hesitated. "They found something." The billionaire's eyes narrowed. "How much?" "We don't know. But they're investigating the old warehouse." For several seconds, Michael said nothing. His jaw tightened. The confidence he displayed publicly began to crack. Not from fear of losing money. Money could always be replaced. What frightened him was something else. The truth. Because if the contents of that warehouse became public, people might begin asking questions he had spent 30 years avoiding. Michael walked back toward the window. The city stretched beneath him. Everything he had built, everything he had protected, everything that could be destroyed. His reflection stared back from the glass, cold, determined, and increasingly desperate. "We're running out of time," Trevor said quietly. Michael's expression hardened. "No." He picked up the development proposal from the table. "We're running out of options." Back at the warehouse, Rachel carefully placed the recovered evidence into a secure case. The sun was beginning to set. For the first time in decades, Walter felt something he had nearly forgotten: hope. Yet as they drove away from the abandoned property, none of them noticed the black SUV parked several hundred yards away, watching, waiting, and reporting every move they made. The morning of Michael Reed's announcement arrived clear and bright. For the first time in weeks, sunlight covered Portland without interruption from rain clouds. Downtown streets buzzed with anticipation as reporters, investors, politicians, and business leaders gathered for what many were calling the most important development project in the city's history. Inside the convention center, banners displaying Reed Development Corporation logos hung from towering walls. Large screens showcased glossy images of luxury towers, parks, and shopping districts. Everything about the event had been designed to celebrate Michael Reed's legacy. Backstage, Michael adjusted his tie in front of a mirror. At 70 years old, he still projected confidence and authority. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his tailored suit immaculate. To the public, he was the man who had transformed Portland's economy. But beneath the polished exterior, anxiety was beginning to show. Trevor Mills stood nearby holding a tablet. "We've checked every entrance," Trevor said. Michael nodded, yet he felt no comfort. For several nights he had barely slept. The warehouse discovery haunted him. Walter Johnson haunted him. For 30 years Michael had convinced himself that the past no longer mattered. Now he wasn't so sure. A few miles away, Ethan Parker parked his aging pickup truck near the convention center. Walter sat beside him. Unlike the frightened man Ethan had first met beneath a rain-soaked awning, Walter seemed different today. Not younger, not stronger, but steadier. His gray beard remained neatly trimmed, and although his weathered face still carried the marks of hardship, there was dignity in his posture that had slowly returned over the previous weeks. Rachel Morgan exited the passenger side carrying a secure document case. Inside were copies of every recovered record, every ownership agreement, every letter, every piece of evidence. Walter looked toward the towering convention center. For a moment, fear returned. What if it isn't enough? Rachel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Truth usually takes longer than lies," she said, "but eventually it catches up." Cooper barked softly from the back seat. The golden retriever had somehow become part of every major moment in this journey. Walter smiled faintly and scratched behind the dog's ears. "You're the one who started all this." Minutes later, the main presentation began. Hundreds of guests filled the ballroom. Camera crews lined the walls. Michael stepped onto the stage to enthusiastic applause. He smiled confidently. For nearly 15 minutes, he spoke about economic growth, jobs, and Portland's future. The audience listened attentively. Then, near the end of his speech, a voice interrupted. "Before you continue, Mr. Reed, perhaps everyone deserves to hear the whole story." The room fell silent. Heads turned. Rachel Morgan stood near the center aisle. Beside her stood Ethan and Walter. At first, many guests appeared confused. Then Michael saw Walter. The color drained from his face. For several seconds, he simply stared. The audience sensed something was wrong immediately. Rachel walked forward. 30 years ago, Walter Johnson was the majority owner of Columbia Steel Industries. Whispers spread throughout the room. Michael remained frozen. Rachel opened the document case. One by one, she displayed the original ownership records recovered from the warehouse. Large screens projected the documents for everyone to see. Reporters rushed forward. Cameras zoomed in. The evidence spoke for itself. Walter had controlled 52% of the company. Not Michael, not the board. Walter. Then Rachel presented another set of documents: private correspondence, financial records, internal memorandums. The room grew quieter with each page. Several journalists exchanged stunned looks. The story was becoming much larger than a corporate dispute. Finally, Rachel revealed the most damaging evidence: a recorded conversation. Years earlier, one former executive had secretly preserved an audio recording and stored it alongside the documents. The recording played through the ballroom speakers. A younger Michael Reed's voice filled the room. The words were unmistakable. He discussed the fire. He discussed removing Walter. He discussed gaining control of the company. Gasps erupted throughout the audience. Some people stood. Others stared in disbelief. Michael's face turned pale. 30 years of carefully constructed reputation began collapsing in real time. Walter listened silently. The recording answered questions that had haunted him for decades. The fire had not been an accident. The betrayal had been real. Everything he lost had been taken deliberately. For a moment he closed his eyes. Not because he felt victorious, because he finally felt free. The ballroom doors opened. Several federal investigators entered. Leading them was Special Agent Daniel Hayes. Daniel was a tall man in his early 50s with short dark hair beginning to gray around the edges. Years of federal service had given him a calm, disciplined demeanor. He wasn't interested in headlines or politics, only facts. He approached the stage. "Michael Reed," he said firmly, "we need you to come with us." The room erupted into chaos. Reporters rushed forward. Cameras flashed continuously. Michael looked around desperately, at the investors abandoning him, at the reporters exposing him, at Walter standing only yards away. For the first time in decades, Michael Reed appeared powerless. Without another word, federal agents escorted him from the stage. By evening, news of the arrest dominated every major media outlet in Oregon. Within weeks, investigations expanded. Civil lawsuits followed. Former executives cooperated. Additional evidence surfaced. The empire Michael had built over 30 years began unraveling piece by piece. Meanwhile, Walter's name was finally cleared. The courts restored a significant portion of the assets that rightfully belonged to him. Friends Ethan never knew existed began reaching out. Former employees came forward with apologies. Newspapers that once condemned Walter now told the full story. But the greatest surprise came when Walter announced what he intended to do with his restored fortune. He would not rebuild Columbia Steel. He would not buy mansions. He would not seek revenge. Instead, he established the Johnson Community Foundation. Its mission was simple: help homeless individuals rebuild their lives, support struggling small businesses, provide second chances. The first business selected for assistance was Parker's Coffee House. The foreclosure disappeared. The building was purchased outright. Renovations followed. New customers arrived. The neighborhood slowly came back to life. Almost a year later, on a quiet spring morning, Ethan sat outside the cafe holding a cup of coffee. Walter sat across from him. Cooper slept peacefully beside the entrance. Children laughed nearby. Neighbors greeted one another. Life felt normal, a luxury Walter once believed he would never experience again. Ethan looked across the table. "You ever think about what would have happened if Cooper hadn't found you that night?" Walter smiled, then glanced toward the sleeping golden retriever. Every day, the old man looked around the neighborhood that had embraced him, not as a homeless man, not as a victim, but as a person, a man whose life had been stolen and whose name had been buried. Yet somehow, after 30 years, the truth had found its way home.